Russia is a big country. Spanning 11 time zones, it shares land boundaries with 14 other countries, alongside two maritime boundaries with Japan and the United States. And it's here, in the Russian Far East, you'll find the Sea of Okhotsk. First discovered by Russian explorers in the 1640s and extensively mapped following the Great Northern Expedition, sometimes also called the Second Kamchatka Expedition, commercial navigation of the sea was all but monopolized by the Russian-American company in the first half of the 19th century. The formation of sea ice, which lowers upper-level salinity alongside heavy water flow that carries oxygen and nutrients, make Okhotsk home to some of the world's richest oceanic fisheries, and starting in the mid-1800s, it was also a primary location for commercial whaling in Russia and later the Soviet Union. Fun fact, well, definitely not for whales, but from 1964 to 1973, the Soviet Union was generally considered to be the biggest whaling nation in the world, with fleets operating in every ocean except the North Atlantic. Lack of enforcement allowed for underreporting, mass illegal catches, and, largely due to Soviet whaling, the blue whale population in the Southern Ocean was reduced to about 350 individuals, or less than 0.15% of their original number. Anyway, getting back to Okhotsk, in more recent times, 29 zones of possible oil and gas accumulation have been identified in the sea, which are estimated to hold 1.2 billion tons of oil and 1.5 billion cubic meters of gas, respectively. Covering an area of some 611,000 square miles, or about 1,583,000 square kilometers, Okhotsk is framed by Sakhalin, a portion of the East Siberian coast, the Kamchatka Peninsula, Kuril Islands, and Hokkaido. Meaning that aside from Hokkaido, which is a part of Japan, the sea is nowadays completely surrounded by territory administered by Russia. So you'd probably assume most of Okhotsk, if not all of it, falls under Moscow's control, right? Well, that is true with a notable exception. Right in the middle sat an area of open ocean outside Russia's exclusive economic zone, the so-called Peanut Hole. Named for its oblong shape, the Peanut Hole was about 35 miles wide and 300 miles long. Now, before going any further, I think it's important to note EEZs are not areas of sovereignty, but rather an area in which a sovereign state has exclusive rights regarding the exploration and use of marine resources. Surface waters in EEZs are still technically defined as international waters, meaning foreign ships can pass through them freely. As per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, EEZs extend 200 nautical miles from the outer limit of a state's territorial sea, which often, though not always, stretches 12 nautical miles from the coast. The main difference here is that a territorial sea confers full sovereignty, while an EEZ only grants sovereign rights to resources. States also do have rights to said resources found on the seabed of what is called the continental shelf, up to 350 nautical miles from the coastal baseline, and this, in fact, may exceed their EEZ. I know, it's a lot, but the long and short of all this being, the Peanut Hole was outside Russia's EEZ, meaning any country could fish there, and some began doing so in large numbers back in 1991. This was a problem for Russia because while Moscow did sell the right to a number of countries to fish within its EEZ, many were instead opting to fish unregulated in the Peanut Hole. And maybe you can guess where this is going, but fish stocks in the Sea of Okhotsk began to plummet due to overfishing. As noted in Moscow News Weekly, 39 Polish super trawlers burst into the central part of the Sea of Okhotsk, followed by 9 large South Korean trawlers and almost the entire Chinese fishing fleet. Somewhat later, fishing ships from Japan, Panama, Bulgaria, and Ukraine appeared. A wild revelry began. Reluctant to observe elementary international fishing regulations, foreign fishermen set to clearing out the wealth of the Northern Sea. In 1991, fleets mostly from China, Poland, and South Korea harvested some 700,000 metric tons of fish in the Peanut Hole. And in 1992, the catch could have been as high as 1 million metric tons. These fish, especially Alaskan pollock, a species of cod sometimes also called walleye pollock, migrated in and out of the Peanut Hole and were therefore designated as straddling stock. a term meaning they moved between the EEZ of one or more states and the high seas. Because of this, Russian efforts at preventing overfishing were largely ineffective. What's more, foreign vessels in the Peanut Hole often would also venture into Russia's EEZ to fish illegally. All of this resulted in what can only be described as a tragedy of the commons. The tragedy here being people having unrestricted access to a finite, valuable resource where personal use does not incur personal expense, tend to overuse it and may end up destroying it altogether. Even if some users exercise voluntary restraint, others would merely supplant them, the predictable result being a tragedy for all. This led to a growing sense of urgency in Moscow, which adopted a decree that prohibited fishing by Russian and foreign vessels in the central Sea of Okhotsk in mid-1993. China and South Korea initially refused to abide by the moratorium, but later the two countries agreed to separate bilateral agreements with Russia, which allowed access to pollock in the Russian EEZ in return for refraining from fishing in the Peanut Hole. Poland, however, refused to abide by the moratorium altogether, while Japan had already ceased fishing for pollock in the Peanut Hole prior to the decree being issued. Later that same year, the Peanut Hole Agreement was eventually signed by all previously mentioned countries, meaning China, Japan, Poland, Russia, and South Korea agreed to stop fishing in the Peanut Hole until pollock stocks recovered, but there was still no framework on how to proceed if that occurred. That being said, in the meantime, Russia, working alongside the United States, also managed to get China, Japan, Poland, and South Korea again to agree to a fishing moratorium in another bit of open ocean known as the Donut Hole. Located in the western Bering Sea, the Donut Hole is a roughly New York State-sized bit of territory 200 miles east of Russia and 200 miles west of the United States, meaning, yet again, it was outside the EEZ of both countries. While an agreement known as the Donut Hole Convention was reached in 1994, overfishing had already caused significant damage here. The Donut Hole, which had an estimated biomass of 13 million tons of pollock in 1982, had by 1992 only about 6% or 750,000 tons of fish left, leading some observers to claim it represented the largest fisheries collapse in the Northern Hemisphere during modern times. And thus, in 2001, Russia petitioned the United Nations to declare the Peanut Hole as part of its continental shelf, essentially bypassing the issue of it being outside its EEZ altogether. A United Nations subcommittee accepted the Russian argument in 2013, and just a few months later, in 2014, the United Nations Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf recognized Russia's claim to the Peanut Hole, meaning the resource-rich Sea of Okhotsk essentially is now fully under Russian control.